This is our last week of Unit 6. We're going to look at Richard Nixon and finish out the presidents of the 60s from JFK to LBJ, and now Nixon will get us into the early 70s when things start to change quite a bit. So let's see. So we're going to talk about Nixon's presidency briefly and then move into Watergate. I'm not going to go into too much detail about Watergate. The video you're going to watch will give you a lot more detail and a lot more names and dates and trials and those kind of things. But we'll just look at the big picture and the outcome and where it came about and that kind of thing, and just a general overview of who Nixon as a person was. So in 1968, Nixon is elected. Now, if you go backwards, remember that he had run for president in 1960 against JFK, right? And lost by just a little tiny bit. Now, the interesting part is he will be the first guy ever to lose the presidential election and then come back and win, which is pretty cool. Another interesting point, let's see. So in 60, he runs and loses. He'll then run for the governor of California, and he'll lose that, and then he'll end up running in 68. Now, no one really expects him to run, but the interesting part about 1968 is that everyone kind of thought that Johnson would run for re-election. Now, he'd only served one term he had been elected for, and remember, you can only serve 2 terms as elected president. He had finished out JFK, so everyone just assumed he would run for re-election. He decides not to. Probably smart for him because the Vietnam War was not going well, and that was all blamed on him, unfortunately, because he did a lot of pretty cool things outside of the war. But Nixon will come in and kind of this wave of conservative popularity, right? People kind of view what's starting to happen in the country as the fault of Democrats and liberalism. And so we'll start to see this rise in conservative government. And that will start with Richard Nixon. Now, we think, yeah, he is very conservative, but you're going to see he does a lot of things that would kind of usually fall into the Democrats' realm, into that big government realm. So he kind of walks the edge between the two parties. So he will run speaking to the silent majority. And I think we talked about this with Vietnam, but the silent majority is that group of people that are working hard, are trying to support their families. They don't have time to go out and protest against a war. They don't have, college degrees where they can be protesting on college campuses. They are silent because they are not that little elite few that can do these crazy protests and crazy things. And that's the majority of America. And that is who Nixon speaks to. Now, he also has a thing called the Southern Strategy, which isn't mentioned here, but he speaks to the Southern states that have been Democrats for as long as there have been these political parties. They're called Dixiecrats because they're kind of conservative leaning, but they're Democrats. And he speaks to them because remember, the civil rights movement has really upset a lot of Southern states. And the civil rights movement belongs to the Democratic Party. And so he talks to the South about states' rights. And that is kind of a coded way of saying, we'll let you have your own decisions, your own states' rights. We won't tell you to enforce the Civil Rights Act. You can do that as a state. So it's kind of this like coded racism, right? Is he racist? No, but he knows he needs to win the South. And how is he going to do that? So very smart Southern strategy. A lot of the Southern states will end up going for him. Now, when he gets into office, he actually does some interesting things. He does try and back up LBJ's big government, but not to a big point. Remember, LBJ came up with Medicaid and Medicare. Those things are still around today. Head Start, free preschool. How do you get rid of those? You can't tell all of the elderly people in the country, hey, we're going to take away your health care. You can't say, oh no, now you can't go to preschool for free. Those are very, very popular. So he can't back up on a lot of those things. He can, and certain things that are not as widespread. He does also end the draft, which is something that he promised he would do in his campaign. Remember, the draft had started several years before and targeted mainly minority groups, low income, young men, right? And so we had this whole group of soldiers, this whole wave of soldiers that did not want to be there and that were feeling like they had been picked on. Um, so he will back up the Great Society. He will end the draft. He'll try and shrink down government, but he can't really do much because so much of it is popular at this time. But on a very liberal front, he creates the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and kind of moves forward with a lot of LBJ's policies in that realm. So he does a lot domestically. He is very successful, but no one really thinks of this stuff when they think of Nixon. They more think of his foreign policy stuff, and that is going to come around because domestically things kind of start going downhill as a nation. The 70s are going to be a pretty big disaster economically for the United States. So there's going to be two main things that happen when Nixon is president. First, we're going to have a period of stagflation, which isn't going to end until the early 80s. Now, that is inflation. Inflation is when your money is not worth as much, so it takes more to buy certain things, right? So if we go all the way back, remember like in between the world wars, how Germany had hyperinflation, how all of a sudden it was like a million marks, would buy you a loaf of bread. So we started to have slight inflation. Nothing like what happened to Germany, but prices are going up. A gallon of gas is getting to, $5 or $6 and that kind of thing. By the 70s, we'll see gas is at like $10 a gallon, if you can even get gas. And we'll get to that in a second. So stagflation is that inflation plus high unemployment. Now, inflation usually comes when there is high employment, and so there's more money circulating. But we're going to see this odd combination, which is not very common, of high unemployment and inflation at the same time. So that's going to be a disaster in the making. The next thing is OPEC, which is still around today, right? Still very important. The oil producing countries, this is their organization. So they get together and they decide this is what we're going to price oil at. We're going to take oil off the market to raise the prices of oil. We're going to put more in the market. There's been a lot of drama with OPEC lately. Right before this coronavirus situation happened, there was a big drama in OPEC. Some of those nations disagreed with each other and ended up flooding the market with oil to lower the prices, trying to force Russia to make some changes. And they flooded the market right when this hit, and no one's driving. And so the price of oil has just plummeted. So that's what's happened now. That is the opposite of what was going on in the late 60s, early 70s. So oil producing countries, they all get together. Most of them are in the Middle East. We've added some like Venezuela lately. But they decide they are going to put an oil embargo, which means they're going to stop selling it. Remember, we did that to Japan, right? Leading up to World War II. They're going to stop selling oil to the United States because they're angry that we support Israel. Israel is kind of, right, it's that new nation founded after World War II, kind of always upsetting the Muslim nations in the Middle East. And we are supporting them in several kind of controversial moves that they make, including the Yom Kippur War, which is an invasion towards Egypt. So we're going to see we're going to get a lot of flack for supporting Israel, and one piece of that is going to be the oil embargo. So not only are the prices of oil going to go up because we have a limited reserve now, but we're going to start to run out of oil. And you're going to see these lines of cars at gas stations waiting to pay so much money for gas, and the gas stations will run out. It is a crazy time in our nation's history. So in order to distract the nation from what is going on domestically, Nixon is going to make some pretty bold moves in the Cold War and abroad with his foreign policy. So not so much with policy, he gets to that afterwards, but just kind of reaching out. And the first thing that he does is he decides to visit China and to kind of reach out to China. And the reason that he does that, he has this foreign policy called détente. And détente is kind of like a standstill, like no one's winning, no one's losing. Let's just like pause everything and try and like move forward peacefully. And he thinks that China will be the easier of the two, right? The Soviet Union's our big rival. China's kind of up and coming. But the United States and China have started to have some mutual conversations and some relationships, and that is actually all going to start with ping pong and well, table tennis. So China table tennis is huge, and so we are going to have like ping pong. Our ping pong team, our national ping pong team, will go into China, kind of the first group to go into China from the United States in quite a long time since they've become a communist nation. And if you've seen Forrest Gump, um, it's not realistic, obviously, but he is part of that team, goes to China. But that is the first group. And so Nixon reaches out and recognizes China as a nation. Remember, after the Communist Revolution, remember in China they had a civil war. The communists won, the nationalists lost, and they fled to the island of Formosa, which will become Taiwan, right? And so for a really, really long time up to this point, we, as in the United States, called Taiwan China. We called that the capital of China. We only talked to Taiwan. We didn't talk to China because it was communist. And so, and we did several nasty things like tried to keep China out of the UN and that kind of thing because we were upset that communism had prevailed. And so in 1972, Nixon will recognize the People's Republic of China and he will go and visit. And it's pretty crazy. There's him and his wife on the Great Wall. And if you look up interviews, like people interview him over the radio, what's it like? And everyone asks him about the food, which is hilarious. So they talk about the food a lot. Now, the reason that he chose to reach out to China was he thought that if China and the United States started to develop a relationship, that would pull China away from the Soviet Union. And that would put a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union to also start to make peace because China and the Soviet Union had kind of been allies for a little bit. The Soviet Union had supported China, the communists in the Civil War, but they'd started to have some animosity. And so now the Soviet Union is kind of on their own. And the United States is starting to make friends with people. And so that's going to kind of put some pressure on the Soviet. So he makes this move with China, and that brings, there's Forrest Gump in China, the Soviet Union to the table. And in 1972, later on in the year, now remember, he's doing all these crazy things. He's going to China, he's eating the food, he's on the wall. It distracts the nation from kind of this ending of Vietnam, from stagflation, from the oil problems. At one point, Nixon will tell just his friends, but like finally, you know, something different is on the front page of the paper, something new is on the news that makes him look good, doesn't make him look bad. So he will go and visit, he'll go to Moscow and we'll begin these conversations. And the big thing that comes out of these will be SALT, and we'll have SALT 1 and later we'll have SALT 2. And this is the strategic arms limitation talks. So this is, there will be a bunch of things that go along with SALT, but it is about taking away that nuclear threat. And this is huge. And while we often only remember Nixon for Watergate and the negative things that he did, SALT, opening up China, starting the EPA, he did some really incredible things for our nation. So let's move to the not so incredible things. Again, I'm not going to get into every detail of these stories. There is lots of information out there on this, and you're going to watch a video specifically on the Watergate scandal and the break-in and what happens afterwards. But if you want to see a great movie about this piece of it, the Pentagon Papers, and the newspaper publishing it, and an eventual Supreme Court ruling allowing them to publish these things that Nixon tried to stop them from publishing. The Post is a really good movie. So Daniel Ellsberg is a former pro-war, fought in Vietnam, military guy who starts to kind of turn the other way after he starts to see kind of how the government is handling this situation, how they are handling the war. And so what is going to happen is that guy right there with a great comb over is Robert McNamara, who is the Secretary of Defense. He actually serves under all the presidents that are involved in the war. He starts with JFK. And he sees how the war is going, but he doesn't really know. He doesn't know what's happening on the ground. And he is a numbers guy. He's the guy that gets on TV and he shows these charts and he's like, look, this many men have died. This many of their men have died. We are winning. He's very into numbers, very into charts. He was actually an executive before this. So he was kind of a business guy. He wasn't a politics guy to begin with. And so he issues he gets a study, he requests a study of how the war is going in Vietnam. And Daniel Ellsberg is part of that study. And he's over there. And now he's kind of a reporter. He's kind of not a reporter, but he is no longer a military guy, but he goes over, and this is during a time, they don't allow this anymore, but when reporters, when writers, when politicians could actually be in with the soldiers. And he is in there and he sees that we are losing. And he sees that the soldiers are disheartened, that they don't want to be there. And when this report comes back, that's what the report says. The report says we are losing the war. It says things are bad. And McNamara covers up this report and continues to tell the American people that we are winning and that things are going well. And Ellsberg is so distraught over this that he, because he is working for the government at the time, is copying nearly 7,000 pages of this study, of this report. And he does it just, he will sneak out sections of the study every night from work, spend all night photocopying them. Because think of this, this is 1969. You're not taking pictures of them on your phone. Like, he has to go and find a big copy machine and copy all the pages. And then he has all these pages, but he doesn't even know. There's so much, he doesn't know what to do with them. So he reaches out to the Washington Post, and that's where the movie The Post comes in, and to several of their reporters, and shows them, and he's actually in hiding in a hotel room with like boxes of these papers, and they're not in order, and they've cut off the page numbers because of how he copied them. And so they have to put all of this together and they start publishing these articles. And Nixon actually stops them from publishing and tries to get a court injunction saying that this is national security, that they are endangering soldiers. But everything is from the past. And so it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yes, you can publish this information. It is not a matter of national security. And it proved that 5 presidents, going all the way back to Eisenhower, had lied to the American public about the situation in Vietnam, what was going on, and the progress that was happening. And so this makes Nixon look terrible because he is the last of these. He obviously knew about all this. He tried to stop this from getting published. Now, this is not Watergate, right? Watergate actually involves something different. It will involve Daniel Ellsberg, but in a different capacity. So that's kind of the start. And we know that Nixon's a little crazy, right? He has his like enemies list, and he has the FBI like researching these enemies, and enemies to him are anyone that doesn't feel the way that he feels or that might be in conflict with him. And he starts to have the FBI like illegally wiretap their phones and start looking for kind of information. Now, he's president. He can probably do those things, and that wouldn't be the end of the world. I'm sure that it's happened before. That's not what he's going to get in trouble for either. But you see this, he's just starting to stack these things up, right? And in the middle of all of this, he has to run for re-election. And sorry, let's skip those 2 slides. All right, there we go. Sorry, so we're going to skip that. That was the wrong picture. It should have been in 1972. He will beat George McGovern to be reelected, right? So he is on his 2nd term as president. I apologize for that one. So we know that Nixon is getting more upset, right? He's got the Pentagon Papers have come out. Now, Nixon knows that how is this information getting out? How are these things happening? And so he creates, and he doesn't actually create this like his group. He's got this like core group of guys around him. They create something that they nickname the plumbers, or people they nickname the plumbers, because they fix leaks. Get it? So their job is to go out and figure out who is doing what and make it stop, right? Now, in 1971, now notice this is right before the 72 election, right? They break into the office, and this is just nuts, of Daniel Ellsberg, Pentagon paper guy, psychiatrist, looking for any information on him that would prove that he is not a reputable source. Now, was that a smart thing? No, all this stuff was already out. Like, it had already happened. It wasn't him, it was the papers, right? Um, and so we kind of start to see Nixon go down this bad path. All right. Now, again, leading up to his campaign for re-election in 1972, we see a couple more things happen, right? So he forms the CRP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, which is nicknamed by those that are not a fan of him, CREEP. Get it? Committee to Re-elect the President. And they do a lot of creepy things. And one of the things that they do, now there's two interesting points to this. The first interesting piece is that we start to see a lot of campaign finance reform coming out of this. And one of the things that Nixon does is CREEP is actually where people send their money. So if you want to support Nixon's reelection campaign, you write a check, because that's what you used to do, and you mailed it to CREEP, not to Nixon's reelection campaign. And so CREEP would use that money however they wanted. And one of the things that they did was they hired these guys to look for dirt on his opponents and on his enemies, right? So one of the things that they will do is they will break into McGovern's, or the Democratic National Headquarters, which is in the Watergate complex, right? Which is where this starts to come in. Now, the Watergate Towers is this huge complex. There's a movie theater, there are doctor's offices. Like, this is not, there's a big hotel. This is not a small thing. There's even like a museum. But that's where the Democratic National Headquarters are located. So they will break in there, most likely trying to bug it. That's what everyone thinks. But the police are called because someone sees the lights in the windows and they are arrested. So they will be arrested. And that is where this starts. Now, Nixon didn't know about this, right? CREEP is a separate entity. It supports him, but it is not him. And so if he had just kind of like said, oh my gosh, these guys know who I am, I'm connected to them, but I didn't know this was happening, he might have gotten away with it. And that's where he starts to get in trouble. So there's the Watergate complex. You can see how huge it is. So this is where he gets in trouble. So CREEP members go to Nixon and they say, oh my gosh, this happened. These guys got arrested. They weren't working under you, but they all have connections to you. And so jokingly, one of the guys says, these guys, it's probably going to take some money to hush them up, right? Like, they're going to go on trial. They're going to, if things get sketchy, they may throw you under the bus. And Nixon says, well, what are we talking? And they say $1 million, jokingly. And Nixon's like, yeah, we can make that happen. So, next step in the scandalous level. So Nixon tells these guys to deny everything, to lie under oath, and he will pay them. And that is a federal crime. And that's where he starts to get in trouble. So now we're going to see two more guys step in. And these two are journalists that worked for the Washington Post. Remember the Post? Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and they are going to start to investigate what is going on. But where this comes from is they actually have a source, someone that calls them and says, hey, I know what's going on. I work in the FBI. Like, something is going on, right? Something is bad. Something is fishy. I know it. And his code name will be Deep Throat. And no one really, until nearly his deathbed, no one realizes that Deep Throat, even when all of this comes out, we're talking years later, it's revealed that Deep Throat was actually Mark Felt, who was the second in command at the FBI. So he's the guy that spilled the beans to these journalists about Watergate and what was going on. So the 5 burglars are arrested. Now they're arrested in Washington, D.C., and D.C., because it's not a normal state, has kind of like weird laws. So they don't actually go on a trial that everyone can see. It's kind of before a group judge. It's an odd thing. But we kind of start to wonder what is going to happen. Okay, now here's the right map. I apologize, you guys. So in 72, remember, that was in 1971, right? Because CREEP was a committee to reelect him. And a lot of what they did was they were trying to mess with McGovern. They were trying to mess with his competitor in the Democratic Party. And he gets elected. Like, there's no way he could have lost this election. I mean, look at this map. Like, he was not going to lose this election. But he cheated anyways. He tried to cheat anyways. It is later revealed, in an interesting point, that now remember, when you're running for president, you're not just like you are by yourself, right? You actually have to run against other people in your party to get the party's nomination to then run against the other party, right? So McGovern actually had to beat out a guy named Muskie, and Muskie was actually way more popular, but his campaign kind of imploded before he even reached the national convention, and now they find out in hindsight that Nixon's creep, right, actually did a bunch of things to Muskie to get him to drop out. And they were involved in that because they thought McGovern would be an easier candidate to run against. So, lots of scandalous things going on behind the scenes here. All right, so he wins by a lot against McGovern. We have had the burglary, the break-in, right? We are starting to have the trial. We have the hush money going out. And after the Washington Post starts to publish these articles, we see an investigation happen, and the Senate begins hearings about Watergate. And it's first called the Watergate incident, but it is about the break-in itself. Like, that hush money piece isn't even really, like, no one really knows about that yet. So it's more about, like, these 5 burglars, what was their connection to Nixon, campaign finance, that kind of thing. So this is in May of 1973. Remember, he was elected in 72, so this is kind of the beginning of his second term. And we start to have these people come up, and no one's really saying anything, but Nixon is getting more and more nervous, and he sits down with that guy right there named John Dean. And John Dean was involved in everything, but wasn't, the mastermind. Like, he was very smart. He knew what was going on. But Nixon sits him down in the Oval Office and says, John, I need to know what's going on. Because remember, like, one of the ways that Nixon was trying to insulate himself was by not knowing all the things that were happening. He says, I need to know what's going on. I want you to make up a whole report and tell me everything, all the bad stuff that has happened, and put your name on it. And John Dean goes, I'm about to get blamed for all of this. They're going to throw me under the bus because I am going to have this report that has my name on it where I admit to all of these things. So John Dean goes on the stand in front of the Senate and says everything. He throws Nixon under the bus. He says everything that he knows, but it's just his word, right? There's no hard evidence until it is found out in the next testimony that there are tapes that Nixon, illegally of course, but in the White House, on the phone in the White House, has recorded every conversation that has ever happened. So he, being so paranoid, has actually got the evidence that will incriminate him. And he knows it. So as soon as word comes out that there are tapes, by the way, interesting point, John Dean, his testimony, when these tapes are actually heard quite a bit later, it will end up that, like, down to the minute, everything John Dean said was true, like photographic memory on point, but there was no evidence. So they didn't know that at the time, right? So we have these tapes, the tapes are there. And this is where things get even more scandalous. So Senate is like, well, we want those tapes. Nixon, give us those tapes. And Nixon says, no, and the Senate will go all the way to the Supreme Court asking for the tapes. And Nixon refuses, and finally we'll have a trial, U.S. versus Nixon, and Nixon will be forced to hand over the tapes. These will be known as the smoking gun tapes. Now look at how long, right? From May of 1973 to August of 1974 before these tapes are finally released. And this is at the same time that the House will begin the impeachment process um, against Nixon. And there will be 3 articles of impeachment, the worst being abuse of power, which how can you deny that he abused his power? And this is when things get really sad for Nixon. So when Nixon finally, first he says, let me just give you the transcripts of the tapes, right? That's the same. Like, why, if you're going to give the transcripts, why wouldn't you just give the tapes? So that's weird, right? So he finally turns over the tapes, but there were 18 and a half missing minutes that he had accidentally erased, right? Um, and, who knows what those might have said, but we now know that John Dean, what he said was true, right? And the tapes reveal everything, and the House is about to impeach him, first president that could have been kicked out of office, and Nixon resigns, right? So on August 9th, 1974, on national television, if you look it up on YouTube, it is one of the saddest presidential speeches I have ever seen. Nixon tells the nation that he is resigning from the presidency, only president to ever resign. And he gives that speech from the Oval Office. He says, I resign effective noon tomorrow. Ford will be sworn in as president. Now, on a totally interesting note here, when Nixon ran for re-election, his vice president was Spiro Agnew. Great name, right? If you want to see scandals, look up him. He's got a lot. Spiro Agnew actually had to resign under scandalous circumstances as vice president. And so Gerald Ford is picked by Nixon to become his vice president. So Ford was never elected to the vice presidency, right, along with Nixon. So he will become the only president to never be elected, right, to either the vice president or the presidency, which is pretty crazy. So Nixon, my resignation effective, walks out trying to have a happy face, right? He's going to head back to California, call it a day, turns around, gives his iconic victory sign, and that is it. So, impact of the Watergate scandal. Let's look. So, Teddy Roosevelt, go all the way back, right? Begins this trend, right? Because our early presidents saw themselves more as organizers, excuse me, not as, of this entire system of leadership, of government, not as a one-man show. Teddy Roosevelt will begin that one-man show, and that will continue to grow and grow and grow until Nixon, because then we begin to see this abuse of power. And after Nixon, Congress will pass several laws about campaign finance, about Senate judiciary hearings, about special prosecutors, right, which we saw with Clinton, and then we just saw again with Trump, right? So it's got to be an outside person that comes in if a president's about to get in trouble. So, oh, that's this right here. Sorry about that. So the Justice Department to investigate